Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and I'll explain the video title shortly, but just to jump ahead, understand that I've been painting rather a lot of goblins recently. I play tabletop war games and roleplay games, so having a vast quantity of goblins painted and ready to go is a useful thing. But any small warband or large army needs a commander. In the case of the goblins, that means a boss. So I had a look through the models that I had, mostly from the Battle for Skull Pass starter set, and I was very much unimpressed by the supposed commander models of them. These two here are supposed to be the boss and the shaman of the army, but in comparison to just a unit commander, they don't look any more impressive. It ties the style in very well, which is good, but they're just not that impressive. Obviously what was required was a rummage through the bits box. Excellent. I'm sure a whole bunch of us have collections of parts from all sorts of different projects. Many hobbies have this kind of thing. Now I found that the Catachan arms and the Goblin arms from one of the multi-part Goblin sets close enough in size and scale that I can use them together and they won't look weird. So my base model, if you didn't see, was one of these old style Gretchen models. These Gretchen come in their hundreds of thousands and just monopose, so I'm going to be converting it. The goblin heads I had a wide choice of because there's always spare heads in Games Workshop boxes, and this is the selection that I chose. A head without a helmet, a spear arm that will be cut and converted, and that sword is from, I think, one of the orc sprues. If I was a proper YouTuber, I'd have an introduction right here, but I'm not, so I don't. And just while I run the video of me assembling this model, I kind of want to go back and explain the video title. So Goobertown Roulette is a little challenge run by Goober of Goobertown Hobbies. I've been watching a lot of model making and painting videos on YouTube recently, and Goobertown popped up a few times, so I've watched a few of those. And this Goobertown Roulette challenge is going through all of your kind of unused models, the ones that go to the back of the shelf or in the bottom of a drawer and never really get seen, that are probably really nice models, but you never actually get around to making them. And you come up with a way of randomly selecting them, and then also you randomly generate some colours and a theme to go with it. And that can give you the kind of inspiration to get some models done that you might not otherwise do. Unfortunately, I got a little sidetracked, as anyone who watches my channel is well aware that happens quite a lot. And in this sidetrack, when I was going through my models to pick out 5 or 10 interesting models, I found the Battle for Skull Pass starter set, which is one of Games Workshop starter set and one of the most common ones on eBay, because no one wants to play the goblins, apparently. So I've got something like 80 or 100 goblins, plus I've got a whole bunch of Gretchen models as well. And instead of picking the nicest one and putting it in the pile with the others to randomly decide, I just started painting all of them. And then I had 30 painted goblins, and I was like, I want a boss for this, and that's where kind of this video comes in. So in terms of actually playing Goobertown Roulette, I haven't really done it yet, because I kind of just went and painted everything, which isn't the intention. But aside from that, getting to grips with the model itself, if you've been following the visuals so far, you'll notice I've been hacking this little Gretchen to bits. I used the Dremel with a cutting disc to cut away the original arms that were moulded all as one because it's a monopose Gretchen, and also to cut away the gun around the belly area to smooth that out as well. The Imperial Guard's left arm was basically just glued on, and the spear right arm was cut at the kind of bracelet to angle it in the right direction. And just here, lining up the sword and the hand to try and make a believable pose. It didn't come out perfect, as we'll see later, but it came out pretty good. And you'll notice that I'm gluing the pieces together with polystyrene cement just to hold them in place so that I can see how things fit together, although I will be taking this apart again into a number of pieces so that I can paint behind those pieces more easily. That's a fairly standard technique in model making after all. So here we have the model put together, and you'll notice on his chest there I've added some kind of tusks, a little jaw piece that I think comes from one of the orc banners, just to give him a bit more character and to cover over the horrible mess from underneath the Gretchen shotgun. Now the shoulders in particular haven't gone on particularly well because I've cut down a Gretchen model to fit Imperial Guard and Goblin arms. They don't fit perfectly, so let's go on and do some epoxy work to cover that up. So I can't give you the full visuals of this because I was doing most of it out of frame. Essentially I got a little bit of milliput and threw a little sheet onto each of the shoulders, and then used a variety of tools including this pin punch to line up as much as I could of the epoxy with the existing features of the model. Going down his back, trying to line up the folds into the folds of his clothes, so that the shoulder pads were actually part of his tunic, not actually armor plates put on top. And again, this kind of went fairly well, but it wasn't perfect. So I broke off the pieces that I wanted to paint separately. Mainly this was just the head and the sword, so that I could get to the shoulders and the details I added to the chest and stomach. Now I put the sword and the head onto little bits of wire and held in place with super glue. And for anyone who's followed my channel for any length of time will know, the super glue didn't work. Both the sword and the head fell off multiple times during this process, and every time I say super glue is terrible and has never been successful, those days are certainly coming to a middle. The main body of the model, on the other hand, I attached to a great big handle, which I think is a lead weight wrapped in some tape. And again I used super glue on the top, and again it fell off. With the sword, just before we go on to priming, I wanted to give a little bit of a rough texture to this. So I used some sandpaper, fairly fine sandpaper. I think I could have got away with a bit coarser sandpaper here. And just gave it a few passes just to add a little bit of texture there that I could kind of take advantage of with the painting step. So now finally getting to the actual painting part of this, you'll notice that I'm not randomly generating any colours like I should be doing, because I'm actually not playing Goobertown Roulette like I should be doing. Instead, when I started painting the goblins, I hit upon a fairly reasonable colour scheme: green for the skin, red for the cloaks, and then some blue details as well. So this model is going to get painted in the same colour scheme to match with everything else. And the first step here is to base coat the vast majority of the model in a light brown. I go over all of the edges of any of the paintwork that comes up, so if I miss any spots, a little bit of brown showing through, particularly with the wash as well, won't be noticeable. Then for the main tunic itself is going to go red. And this is deliberately a thinned down red, so that some of the brown doesn't necessarily show through as brown, but it gives a patchy colouring that kind of gives the impression that it's a dirty material that's been around for quite a while. Now here we get into the first bit of experimentation, and that is with this yellow. I've had a great amount of trouble with this yellow since I bought it probably 20 something years ago. And I've never been very successful with this yellow. But as I've been poking around YouTube recently, watching a lot of people who are better at this than I am, I've picked up a few tips, and particularly in this case, I'm going to be doing some layering and some blending. So the first layer over the top of the brown base coat is a mix of that same brown with some flesh tone. The flesh tone lightens it up and brings it closer to the yellow without becoming patchy like the yellow would if I just layered it on. The next layer is to mix the flesh tone and the yellow. That then brings in a lot of the true yellow, but with a lot of still this flesh tone mixed in with it. That flesh tone helps it go on in an even coat. The next layer over the top of that is a straight yellow, and that makes it really nice and bright. And that top layer is partially translucent, but it's showing up the layers underneath. Now I did manage to get some highlights going on here. The top layer of yellow was heaviest across kind of the fold of this sash. It's not ideal, but it's a little bit that helps. I also did a line around the top of his boots and these three kind of tassely things out the back of his neck in that same layered yellow colour, and I think that came out fairly well. The next step is to have a look at the bone pieces, the crossguard for the sword and the jaw chest kind of decoration. And this is simply a white dry brush over the brown base coat, and then we'll let the wash deal with it later on. I do think that I should have done the teeth in this same technique, but I didn't, unfortunately. So another bit of experimentation for me here. This is using a darker brown to give a shadow to the underneath of the sword's grip. I'm imagining it being some kind of leather or material wrapped around the grip, and so having a lighter brown on the top and a darker brown at the bottom will give some of that impression, and when it comes to washing and then highlighting afterwards, that might look good, but this is the first time I've experimented with something like this. Moving on to the metallics. In this case, I was trying a similar layering technique, trying to get the impression of shadows and a sharpened blade by using a first layer of mixing my silver paint and black paint to make it a very dark metallic, and then highlighting it with just the silver by itself. Unfortunately, this didn't really come out, and the finished product, the sword, it does look like an inconsistent metal surface, which is part of what I was going for, but it certainly doesn't have the highlights that I was aiming at. The bracelet thing also got the dark metallic and light metallic to try and get some highlights. It didn't really turn out any better than the sword, but it's a smaller area, so it's less noticeable. Here I'm doing the base coat for the skin, which is a darker green. Now I could and should have done this step at the same time as doing the brown base coat for everything else. That way I could have checked that I've got an even coverage of at least something covering the primer in every spot. But with the other goblins that I've been painting, I've gotten into the order of doing the red for the clothing before doing the base coat for the skin, and that's to stop any red showing through on the skin, because I was painting over that with the dark green base coat. For this model I could have done things differently, but I went with what I knew. So here we have my wash, and I'm decanting it into a plastic pot so that I can keep the bubbles in the jar, or at least most of them. And then I'm salvaging some black and brown paints from my palette just to add to the wash to make sure it's got the right consistency and colour. And then it's a very careful case of getting just the right coverage on the model to get it evenly in every spot. Perfect, there you go. And immediately after that, I kind of clean up the wash using a dry paintbrush to wick away wash where I didn't want it, but also going through the bottom of the pot where the wash is at its thickest, I can add in some darker bits of wash exactly where I want them. Now this next section is going to be completely out of focus, unfortunately. That's the problems of using your phone as your camera. Now there was a video on YouTube that I saw recently where someone used a Caucasian skin tone to put highlights onto goblin skin, and it did look very good. Now I've spent at least 17 seconds searching for this video and I couldn't find it, so unfortunately I can't show you their example, but I'm not going to use the Caucasian skin tone as a highlight over the top. I'm not quite brave enough for that just yet. What I will do, however, use it as an underlayer highlight. So I'm going to put on some Caucasian skin tone on top of the dark green that I will then put a lighter green on top of. Wherever I've put the Caucasian tone, the light green will appear brighter, and anywhere that I haven't put it, it will appear darker. So the bridge of the nose, the eyebrows and the ear, and I tried to concentrate this on the right hand side of the face so that it looks like light is coming from that side. I also gave a little bit of this same highlight to the right arm as well. And also, have I mentioned, I hate super glue. Another quick detail here, just some black spots for the eyes. I don't mind being a little bit messy here because I can come back with the lighter green and clean it up later. To add some detail here to the teeth, I'm going to use a similar layering technique to what I did with the yellow. However, I'm deliberately making this a lot messier because I want to get some texture out of the fangs. So I start with a flat brown base coat, the same light brown I've used for most of this model, mixing in the white and the brown together to get a kind of mid-tone, and then white over the top. And again, I'm not coating the entire thing to make a flat white. All the coffee drinkers out there are chuckling. What I'm using with the white is to actually highlight the tip of the tooth. Unfortunately, as with most of this painting work, I'm not very good at painting, so it didn't come out very well. And while I had the white and brown mix out, I went and gave some highlights to the tusks of the chest piece. And I took some yellow and went back over the sash just to bring back the highlights that had kind of disappeared with my heavy-handedness earlier. just trying to get that main fold lighter than the area around it. So finally we're getting to the light green that is even called Goblin Green on the pot. This highlight goes over all of the skin tone, and I'm fighting with trying to make it a thinned, smooth layer, but also a dry brush. All of the rest of the goblins were just hit with this as a dry brush, but because I've got the highlights underneath the green in this case, I actually want to make it more of a very thin layer. And that kind of opposition of techniques did give me some, I don't want to say confusion, but I had to think harder than I usually like to. Going over the face with this, by the time I'd sorted out my technique over the arms, I was in a better position to do the face, and those highlights did come through. The right side of the face is quite definitely lighter than the left side. And then after all that work, I did just a few more highlights over the top with the green. And the shoe's got a flat black, just like every other shoe in this army so far. So now I'm adding in some extra detail and cleanup to the red. The red tunic is kind of the big noticeable colour in this army, so it has to be really good on this model in particular. The wash did a good job of bringing out some of the folds, having that darker colour in there, but in some places there are tide marks. So I'm using the red to kind of mix those back in, keeping the dark paints from the wash, but mixing in water and more red paint just smooths them out and makes them look less like a tide mark and more like the darker kind of shadow that they should be looking. Also on the higher points, the ridges in the tunic, they need to be made into a highlight. So using just the flat red over the top of that, that's a lighter colour than even the lightest colour previous to that, because it was darkened by the wash. I will admit that the bottle I glued to the back of this model was a little bit of an uninspired extra detail just to use something, and because of that I forgot to paint it all the way through, and just right at the end here I noticed that, oh wait, that hasn't been painted. I also realised that nowhere on this model is any blue, and blue is the contrasting colour of the entire army so far. So having a little bit of blue on this model, even on the back, is really quite important. So the bottle, therefore, became blue. I started with this very dark blue. On the camera it looks almost a black, and in person it looks nearly black as well. And then I used a much lighter blue as a highlight. I tried to put this highlight on from the same direction that the light would be highlighting the other parts of the model. The right side of the face, the right arm, and therefore the right side of the bottle should be lit up in kind of the same way. So I was looking at it from that angle and trying to trace around the edge from that point of view to get that highlight. And it came out acceptably, but not amazingly. So then it's just a quick step to paint the base and finally get around to assembling the model. A quick word on bases. I have no particular interest in scenic bases for something like this, because this is intended for gaming use, tabletop war games, tabletop roleplay games. So having a massive scenic base that takes up a lot of space on a gaming table doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, we really should get on and do a scenic base at some point for a model that it's appropriate for, but this one just isn't. So it got a flat green, because playing on a green tabletop, that base kind of disappears and just leaves the model by itself, and that's what I prefer. When it comes to assembling the model, I again had more trouble with super glue, because I had to scrape or sand it away to expose the plastic so that the polystyrene cement could do its job. And the last step will just be a clear coat. The entire army has quite a glossy clear coat, and I haven't decided whether I want to go over that with a matte clear coat as well. And the model is done. I've even made a little turntable out of a fidget spinner and a spray can lid just to display it. I've used more techniques in this model than I've ever used in painting a model before, and in this case I've even named it. Fracas is of course the French word for a little fight, which is appropriate for a goblin, and spelled phonetically because goblins. So let's talk about Goobertown Roulette again, because I think even though I didn't play Goobertown Roulette, I didn't follow the rules and randomly generate anything, I think I have achieved all of the goals set out for Goobertown Roulette. The obvious goal, of course, is to be inspired, and to paint models that you wouldn't otherwise paint, and stuff that sits in drawers or in a bag somewhere. 80-something goblins later, I think we've achieved that. Another one of the goals that Goober puts out is to use new techniques. Now he does that by randomly generating colours and being forced to apply those colours to a model that you might not think to use those colours originally. In this case, I have actually used techniques I haven't used before. The layering and mixing colours and shading and underlighting are all techniques that I've never put onto a model before for a car here. So in a way, I've achieved everything that you're supposed to achieve by playing Goobertown Roulette without actually playing Goobertown Roulette. So did I fail or did I win by cheating? I guess that's for you to decide. Certainly this model achieved everything that I wanted it to achieve. If I put the intended boss model into a unit of spearmen, he's quite clearly the boss of these spearmen. However, to me this looks like a unit commander. However, if I then go and put ED-SKaR into this unit, well, he's much more important. He's got massive great big sword and is certainly in charge. He's not the unit commander, he's the army commander, at least to me in the way I look at it. And a bonus on top of that is that even his sword is truly a great sword by goblin standards, because it's the same length as all of the spears that the spear goblin are using. So is it some amazingly painted model that's going to win competitions? No, of course not. It's nowhere near good enough. But is it a model I had fun painting and good practice for better techniques that I've never used before, and also a practical model that I can actually use in games? Well, yes. Yes it is. That makes this a success in my book. And so, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.